Election cycles sure paint a picture of a country divided.
Well, they sure do. But there are some things we agree on.
Like what?
Well, like 80% of the country doesn't like Citizens United. You know, the Supreme Court decision, which says that campaign money is free speech. And no wonder. I mean, it's turned elections into a marketplace, and democracy is now for sale.
I'm glad it's a bipartisan issue, but what most people don't realize is that it's been part of a long-term corporate strategy going back 30 years. The Citizens United decision didn't just come out of the blue. It's more like a victory lap for a 3-decade-long campaign. Here, watch this.
The roots of Citizens United lie in a radical corporate agenda dating back to 1971. Lewis Powell, a lawyer for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, wrote a memo called An Attack on the Free Enterprise System. In it, he argued that an activist-minded Supreme Court may be the most important instrument for economic and political change. That same Lewis Powell was a director of a dozen large corporations, including Philip Morris, a global provider of cigarettes. And that's also the same Lewis Powell who was appointed to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon.
He was really able to implement, slowly at first and then quite rapidly on the Supreme Court, creating a 5-4 majority for this notion that corporations are like people, and the idea of corporate speech rights was born for the first time in American history.
Powell's memo pointed out that while business was winning in the economy, it was losing the larger political battle. It urged corporations to move to Washington, start lobbying Congress, and force legislation in its favor. Corporations got the message. Thousands of lobbyists descended on Washington. Think tanks were formed to churn out pro-business research. Legal foundations were established with the backing of corporate dollars. Powell's memo was radical for the time, and it was also private. It never came to light during his confirmation hearings.
It wasn't until after he was on the court that the memo leaked, and it was somewhat controversial at the time, understandably, as now Americans found that a Supreme Court justice had gotten onto the court with a clear agenda to create new constitutional rights. The court was heading towards a dangerous precipice, considering giving unprecedented rights to money and corporations in our democracy.
Wow, who knew? Well, somebody must have. It wasn't anyone minding the store.
Well, maybe we took too much for granted and forgot what it takes to be a citizen in a democracy. Power used to be in the hands of the people. Do you know that 20 million people took to the streets during Earth Day in 1970? The EPA was formed. Congress enacted a wave of environmental laws that cleaned up our air, water, and land.
Sure, and we took on the challenges of civil rights, equal rights for women, safer cars, healthier food, and corruption in government, and not to mention campaign financing reform.
We amended the Constitution and passed legislation to secure voting rights for all Americans. We even ended the war in Vietnam.
And we actually had some control over our lives and could affect change. But then we sat back and thought that the presidency, Congress, and the courts would be the stewards for the people. Instead, when we weren't looking, the power shifted to business, and we citizens became consumers. We need to get back into the fight.
Absolutely. Citizens have been inactive for too long. You'll remember when this first affected elections. You were living in Massachusetts during the 70s, weren't you?
Yeah, I know where you're going with this. Some corporations with a lot of dough, businesses like Gillette and the Bank of Boston, filed a lawsuit against Frank Bellotti, the state attorney general. See, they challenged a law which prohibited corporate spending on citizen ballot initiatives. And it went to the Supreme Court, which ruled for the very first time that corporations had speech rights and they could spend freely.
Guess who wrote that 5-4 decision? Yep, Lewis Powell, the lawyer who wrote the corporate rights game plan for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Powell convinced a majority of the court to believe the mantra that corporations are persons and corporate voices must be free. Do his words have a familiar ring to them?
Corporations are people, my friend. We can raise taxes on, of course they are. Everything corporations earn ultimately goes to people.
Not to be too cynical, but bags of corporate cash are no longer just bags of cash. They're now called free speech.
The idea that corporations have a right to free speech is inherently absurd.
It's gotten to be so absurd that if it weren't so outrageous, it would be funny. Here, look at this. In the 90s, a beer company put a frog on its label, flipping off the consumer. State law prohibited such an image as being obscene, but a federal appeals court overruled the law based on the brewery's right to free speech.
Equally absurd, but not as funny. When I was living in Massachusetts, here, you see these kids at school? Tobacco companies call them replacement smokers. State law prohibited them from advertising within 1,000 feet of schools. So, the tobacco companies sued the state, and the Supreme Court overruled the law, saying that it violated tobacco's right to free speech.
This strategy has spread. Corporate interests have been using their millions to influence state judicial elections and even local political campaigns.
To button up this conversation, I think it's fair to say that the bogus creation of corporate free speech is changing the very fabric of American society, and it's been doing so for more than 30 years.
Absolutely. It's time to get involved. Let's help overturn Citizens United and take back constitutional rights as belonging to the people.
With American Promise, I'm confident we will pass and ratify the 28th Amendment in just a few years. I think that on July 4th, 2026, when Americans come together to celebrate our 250th anniversary of independence, that we will also celebrate the passage and ratification of the 28th Amendment that restores once again equal citizenship, equal representation, our rights as human beings, and our responsibility to govern ourselves.